There are several options for pillowing ebony plugs. We have 30 plugs in each chair. Our set of 8 chairs requires 240 plugs.
Making a few plugs for a single item, well, that maybe isn't such a big deal, but making 240? Each time you save 10 seconds per plug, that's 40 minutes.
And if it makes the process easier and more consistent, that's a bonus.
We tried several of the methods described in books and online and settled on making Peart's plug pillowing jig.
The plans are in Darrell Peart's second book on Greene and Greene details. See the link in the show notes.
I tried to make my jig like his. I'm not quite sure I made it exactly to his directions, but it works. You can find the plans for this jig in Darrell Peart's book in the Greene and Greene style, Projects and Details for the Woodworker. I thought I'd give you an example of what we did to put together our jig. So the bottom base is set up at 8.5 inches wide by about 13 inches across. The riser in the back is sized to put the block at the proper angle to pillow the face against the sander. See Darrell's book for the specific dimensions. The block also helps determine the angle that the rods will meet the sanding surface. A thinner block would produce a steeper angle. In use, this angle helps produce the pillowing on the ends of the rods. As you sit the rod in the hole, the corners are going to be sticking up further and more into the sanding belt, so those are going to get sanded off a little bit more than the flat sides. It's important to resist the urge to push the rod too far into the hole on the flat sides, because that'll produce a beveled look. And also, as you turn the rod in the hole, it's going to normally, if you're turning clockwise, it's going to take off a little bit more on the left side of the pillowing than on the right side. The base that the block sits on, this is 12 inches deep by 5 inches wide. The angled board is actually just designed to hold the angle correct as you run the ebony rods through the holes. So it may make more sense to make this the full width of this block of wood with the holes instead of cutting it short. The top of this is all just glued together. So I've glued the riser onto the base. Then the block is glued to the base. The front piece is glued to the side of this, set square, and even with the front edge of the base. We used this bar to square everything up to the face of the jig and to give something to glue this surface against. In Darrell Peart's book, it shows a fastener attached right about here into this bar. On the bottom, I've got a bar screwed into place that is square with the front and sides, that fits into the track on our sander, that'll hold this perfectly in place and the correct distance away from the sander without getting it skewed off angle a little bit, so that everything lines up the way it should. Then to drill the holes into the block, I marked out where I wanted the center of the holes to be and drilled them out on a drill press. I've marked the block with the punch size and the slightly larger ebony rod size, both in a fraction and in a micrometer reading. I've added an additional feature to my jig in that against this block, I have a 5/16 of an inch gap to a square cutting surface that I use a pole saw in order to cut off each of my plugs as I make them. So I'll make the plugs, set it in, cut it off, flip the stick over, cut the other end of the plug off, and repeat the process again. I've made a spacer that's 1/16 of an inch. I just set that in place here, which reduces the distance from my cutting edge from 5/16 down to 1/4 of an inch so that I get 1/4 inch long plugs.
Darrell Peart has a video covering this jig and how to use it on the Popular Woodworking YouTube channel, and we'll put a link up here for you to check that out. We believe that this perpendicular bar on the jig is either meant as a handle to move the jig back and forth, or as a wrist rest, which is what we see in Darrell's current demonstrations. In fact, Darrell's first book even instructs, while moving the jig back and forth, twirl the stock in the hole. That seems very impractical. Unless you have extra hands.
Okay, so I've cut and squared up the ebony rods that I need to do all of my plugs, all 310 of them, and I'll be taking them over to the jig that I made and pillowing the ends of these using the jig, the sander, and a hand method, kind of a swooping hand method to get them done, and finishing them off with a buffer. Okay, so I'm going to start off using the 5/16 rod, which is actually 21/64. And when you insert it into the hole for the jig, you want it to rest on the bottom in the back and pull it up to the top in the front. Then you want to spin it in the hole as the sander is running. That'll take off just the top corners of your bar. Okay, so you can see on this where, hopefully you can tell, it's taken off just a tiny bit off of each corner, giving it a slightly curved top to it. Trying to find a place where you can see where it's actually curved, but yeah, it's got a small little pillowing on the top here. And I'll do that with each of my rods. Then I'll take them over to the sandpaper. And now that I have all my sticks pillowed slightly with the sander, pretty much the same uniform shape on the tops, I'll take them over to my sanding station. The next set of sanding stations is actually pretty simple. I've got an old cut up mouse pad as a backer. I've got a 220 sandpaper followed by a 320 and either 600 or 800 here on top of a little softer foam padding. This is actually just sandpaper to help hold it stiff and still on the bench. And then the last thing I'll follow up with is a little bit of jeweler's paste on top of a buffing wheel to finish out the nice shiny edge on the ends of the ebony. Set them around this way. The method that I'm using is one that's described by Darrell Peart in his book. It's essentially what I've found works for me the best is to use, as he describes it, a pendulum motion back and forth, but to ensure that I don't get angled off too much on any one side of it, I find that rotating it 4 times is going to be the best for me, at least, to ensure that I get an even pattern on the pillowed ends. It only takes about 2 swipes each direction, so that gives me the first initial pillowing that takes it a little bit on the edges by scraping it to the full pendulum both directions. It kind of pulls that down into the end of each of the rods. And then the 320, you can see where it's starting to get a little bit shiny and pillowed. You can see how it sinks into this much more than it does on the harder paper over here. That allows it to come up on the sides of the pillowing and get it a little bit more smooth on those edges. And final on the buffer. That's all it takes, and it gives you a really nice, shiny, polished appearance on the ends of the rods. And so I don't have to keep doing that. I'm going to just get everything ready to go and stack them up here next to this so that I run that only at one time. So one of the things that I'll probably be doing in the future is, instead of just rounding off one end at the sander initially, I'll do both ends of my rods, so that I'll be cutting both ends off, going twice as fast, not having to make as many steps back and forth. It'll be much more efficient. Now that I have all my ends polished on my rods, I'll be taking this over to cut them off to length. The final step in producing the plugs is to chamfer the edges so that it fits into the plug holes correctly by taking off just a little bit, about halfway down from each side. By chamfering the lower edges of each of the plugs, I ensure that I have a size that's going to fit into my plug holes without damaging the edges. As I tap the plugs into place, they'll press outward on the fibers surrounding it and fill that hole tightly. I was able to complete all of the plugs for the chairs in less than 3.5 hours.